The quiet love story built on subtle glances and silent connections. Before I tell you what happened, you need to understand how I used to see the world. I believed in patterns. Not destiny, not luck, not chaos, but in a kind of invisible architecture beneath everything. If someone smiled at you every morning at the same time, it meant something. If it rained on your birthday every year, it was a pattern, not a coincidence. I took comfort in these small repetitions because they gave structure to what often felt like an unstable life. And then she walked in. Not into my life all at once, not like the movies, no. She slipped in quietly, like the wind changing direction. You only notice after the leaves start moving differently. I met her in early spring, one of those days that couldn't decide if it was winter or something new. The sky was heavy, but the sun was persistent, melting patches of ice on the sidewalks. I was sitting alone in a small café that overlooked the park, not because I liked the coffee. God, it was terrible. But because I liked the way people passed by the window. Old couples who moved slowly and in sync, young parents pushing strollers and pretending not to look exhausted. And then there were the runners who seemed determined to escape something. It made me feel like I was inside life but didn't have to participate. That day I was sketching something abstract in the corner of a torn notebook. Not really drawing anything, just scribbling my mood. She sat down at the table next to mine, facing the window like me. She didn't notice me at first. She had her buds in and a bag too large for her frame slumped at her feet. Her coat was still zipped up, like she hadn't decided if she would stay. She ordered chamomile tea and then stared out at the melting snow, like she was waiting for a sign. I should have looked away. I usually did. But there was something about the way she blinked, like each one was a reset, a full restart of thought. She didn't sip her tea until it cooled. She pulled out a book I couldn't see the title of and read 3 pages before closing it again. Then she just sat there, quiet. That kind of silence between strangers is rare. Most people fidget, check their phones, or pretend they're not aware of being seen. But she didn't perform solitude. She simply was. That unsettled me more than I expected. The first time our eyes met was through the glass reflection. I was looking at her, she was looking at the same runner I had just silently judged. Our eyes didn't actually meet, they passed through each other's images like ghosts. And yet I felt something shift. Not romantically, not yet. It was more like finding a word in a language you thought you'd forgotten. She left before I did. She stood up without a glance in my direction, as if our shared silence meant nothing to her. But I watched her leave, noting the way she stepped around the wet patches like they were memories she didn't want to disturb. That should have been it. A moment. A day, a passing figure in the periphery of my little rituals. But the next day she came back, same table, same tea, same unread book. This time she nodded at me. Not a hello, not a smile. Just a simple acknowledgement that I existed, and somehow that was enough to make me return the next day. And the next? For weeks, we shared that space without speaking. Sometimes she would sketch too, her lines more confident than mine. Sometimes she would actually read her book, occasionally pausing to laugh at something or shake her head in disbelief. I began to time my visits with hers. It wasn't stalking. I never followed her, never asked her name. I just adjusted my habits around her presence, like a tree leaning toward the light. We became familiar in a wordless way. I knew she preferred the seat by the window, but only when the sunlight didn't glare. She knew I stirred my coffee 5 times, even though I never added sugar. One day, she started bringing an extra pastry and placing it between our tables. Never pushing it toward me, never saying it was mine. But she never ate it, so I did. That was the closest thing we had to a conversation for nearly 2 months. And then one day, she didn't come. I waited the full hour. I drank 2 cups of coffee. I even ordered chamomile tea and hated myself for it, but she didn't show. I told myself it was fine. People have lives, they miss days. But the next day, she wasn't there either, nor the day after. A week passed. Then 2. I stopped going to the café. It wasn't just about her absence. It was about what it revealed. That in the silence between us, I had made a home, and that home had vanished without warning. I tried to shake it off. I threw myself into work, into friends, into pretending I hadn't built my mornings around a stranger. But I had, and I hated how that made me feel. Weak, dependent, naive. Until one morning, a full month later, I returned to the café. I don't know why. Maybe I just wanted to bury the ghost of it once and for all. The table was taken by someone else. But mine, the one I never really claimed, was empty. I sat, ordered the bad coffee, and stared out the window. And then she walked in, coat zipped, book in bag, eyes scanning the room like she didn't know what she was looking for. When she saw me, she stopped. Her mouth opened slightly, not quite a smile, not quite shock. And then, with the kind of certainty that felt like a confession, she walked straight to my table and sat down across from me. No earbuds, no chamomile tea, just her and me and the months that had stretched between us like a bridge we had both hesitated to cross. We didn't speak, we just looked. And in that looking, something shattered. Not in a bad way, more like breaking glass to get to the message inside. Finally, after what felt like another lifetime, she reached into her coat pocket and slid a small folded note across the table. I hesitated before opening it. Inside, in a rushed but careful hand, were 6 words. Sorry I left. I was afraid. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just a pattern. This was the wind, changed and deliberate, trying to bring her back. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew I wouldn't let her vanish again without a fight. Even if it meant breaking every pattern I'd ever trusted, because some things are worth the chaos. And she was one of them. I didn't answer her note with words. I didn't even nod. I just pushed my coffee toward her, a quiet offering, and watched as she took a slow sip, her lips touching the same side of the cup I had used. That small act felt far more intimate than anything spoken. I didn't need her apology. And she didn't need forgiveness, at least not in that moment. What she needed was space, and what I needed was time. And for the first time since she disappeared, we had both again. That morning stretched longer than usual. She didn't bring a book. I didn't bring my sketch pad. We just sat, caught between silence and something like relief. Every now and then, our eyes would meet, and I would catch the edges of something she wasn't saying. I didn't press her. I had learned, through absence, that rushing her was like chasing a snowflake. It only guaranteed loss. She left before I did again, but this time, she touched my wrist before rising. Just the lightest brush of fingers, like checking if I was real. And this time, she looked back at me once as she stepped outside, her reflection in the glass sharp and full of something that almost looked like hope. The next day, she wasn't at the cafe, nor the next, but I wasn't spiraling like before. I understood now that she moved in her own orbit, and sometimes it overlapped with mine. That had to be enough, until it wasn't. A week later, she reappeared. This time she brought a thermos of tea instead of ordering, and when she sat beside me, not across, but beside, I felt the weight of her presence like sunlight on skin after a long winter. I didn't run, she said, breaking months of quiet. Her voice was softer than I imagined, measured, like each word was auditioned before being spoken. I just couldn't stay. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She wasn't looking for answers. She was excavating truths she had buried beneath her routines. I'd been doing well, she continued, still staring ahead. I thought I had figured out how to be alone. I liked it. But then I started liking the space we shared, and that scared me. Because I don't know how to keep something like that. Her hand was on the table, fingers curled slightly. I wanted to reach for it, but I didn't. She looked like someone on the edge of a cliff, reached too quickly, and she'd fall back instead of forward. Everyone leaves, she whispered. Or worse, they stay and you realize you're more alone with them than without them. That struck something deep. I knew that version of loneliness, the kind that fills a room even when someone else is in it. I'd lived that in a previous relationship that taught me the danger of holding on too tightly to something that was already slipping away. "But you didn't feel like that," she added suddenly. "With you, it was different, and that made it worse." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I'm not built for permanence. I never was." That day ended with a question neither of us asked. Not with words, at least. But it hung in the air like a missed train. Can you love someone who's afraid of being loved? Over the next few weeks, we began seeing each other in places outside the café. Quiet walks through the city, mostly at dusk. I discovered she hated loud places, that she walked faster when she was anxious, and that she spoke more freely when it was raining. She found out I used to write poems and hadn't told anyone since I was 19. She asked me to write one for her. I told her I already had. Dozens in my head every time she vanished, and I tried to make sense of the emptiness. Sometimes we'd talk for hours, and sometimes we'd just sit on a park bench and watch the lights flicker on in the windows of strangers' homes. She said she liked imagining what kind of lives they lived, whether they were happy or pretending, whether they had someone waiting for them or just waiting out the loneliness. She had a fascination with sadness, not in a performative way, but in a way that suggested she understood its architecture better than most. One night in the middle of June, we ended up on her apartment rooftop. She didn't invite me up. She simply opened the door and looked back, expecting me to follow. The city buzzed beneath us, blurred lights and distant horns. We drank something warm from chipped mugs and leaned against the railing like we were sharing a secret with the stars. "My mother left when I was 10, she said without warning. No note, no goodbye, just didn't come home one day." I turned slightly toward her, but she didn't meet my gaze. I spent years thinking I'd done something, that if I'd smiled more or talked less or eaten all my vegetables, she would have stayed. Her laugh was sharp, metallic. Turns out she had a whole other family, a whole other version of herself. She finally looked at me then. So when I feel something real, I panic. I see the exits first, the ways out, the cracks before the beauty. I wanted to tell her that not everyone leaves, that some people stay, even through the mess. But I didn't want to be another promise she couldn't believe in. So I just said, "I'm still here." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "I know," she whispered. That night, for the first time, she didn't walk away first. I stayed until the sun started to rise and the world blurred into soft gold. We kissed for the first time that morning, unplanned, unspoken, like breathing. I thought that would be the turning point, the moment her fear would begin to dissolve. But fear doesn't vanish just because you love someone. In fact, it often sharpens. She began to pull away in quieter ways, shorter texts, longer pauses, canceled plans with vague explanations. I told myself it was fine, that she needed space. But a part of me began building walls again, anticipating the next vanishing act. Then came the storm. Not metaphorically, a real one, the kind that turns the city into a surreal painting. Streets flooded, power lines sparked, phones lost signal. That night I couldn't reach her. Her apartment was across the river, and every bridge was closed. I waited, watched the news, paced like a madman. I wasn't even sure why I was panicking until I realized that I wasn't afraid of losing her again. I was afraid I wouldn't get to say goodbye, if this was the end. At dawn, when the storm had calmed and the sky was a bruise of gray and lavender, I ran to her building. The elevator was dead. I took the stairs, breathless by the time I reached her floor. Her door was ajar. My heart stood open. She was there, barefoot, sitting on the floor with candles all around her and a soaking wet cat in her lap. She looked up, eyes swollen, mascara smeared. "I thought I lost you," I said, and my voice cracked. "I'm the one who leaves, remember," she said with a ghost of a smile. I walked over, dropped to my knees, and hugged her, tight, like if I let go, the storm would come back, and this time, it would take her with it. We didn't speak much after that. Not that day, not the day after. But something shifted. I could see it in the way she looked at me. Less like I was something fragile she might break, and more like someone who had already survived being broken. We became more real after that. Fewer games, more truth. I met her sister, who lived in another city and spoke like she was holding every word hostage. I learned that she collected postcards she never sent, that she kept them in a box labeled almost. I told her she didn't have to run anymore, that I wasn't going anywhere, that I understood fear, but I wasn't afraid of her. "You should be," she said once. "I ruin good things." "You don't," I answered. "You protect yourself. There's a difference. But love is not a cure, it's a mirror." And over time, the reflection she saw in my eyes began to overwhelm her. One morning, I woke up and she was gone. Again. No note this time. Just absence. Heavy and hollow, I searched everywhere, called everyone. Nothing. Weeks passed. I tried to convince myself this was her pattern and that she needed time. But it felt different, like this was final, like the door she had cracked open was now sealed shut. And then, one day, I got a letter. Postmarked from a small town I'd never heard of, no return address. Inside was a single line, "If you still believe in the wind, come find me." My hands shook, my chest ached. But even then I knew, this wasn't the end. This was the next direction the wind had chosen, and I had to follow. I packed lightly. Not out of optimism, but out of caution. A few clothes, my notebook, her last letter. I didn't know how long I'd be gone, or if I'd even find her, but I had to try. It wasn't just about chasing a person anymore. It was about chasing a question that had been gnawing at me for months. Was I enough for someone who never thought they were worthy of staying? The town was smaller than I expected. One of those coastal places that doesn't show up on most maps, where time feels slower and the air is heavy with salt and silence. It wasn't beautiful in a postcard way. It was raw, weather-beaten. The kind of place you go to forget, or to remember something too painful to hold in the city's bright lights. I arrived at dusk. The bus station was nothing more than a bench and a faded schedule pinned to a wooden post. The sky was smeared with orange and violet, and the ocean beyond the cliffs sounded like it was trying to tell secrets no one could understand. I didn't have a plan, just her words and a feeling. I wandered for hours, asking no one, expecting nothing. I looked for signs the way you do when you're desperate. Patterns in the cracks of the pavement, meaning in every face I passed. It was ridiculous. And yet, part of me believed she wanted me to find her, that she wouldn't have sent the letter if she hadn't left some kind of trail. The first real clue came from a bookstore. Not a shop, exactly, but a converted room in someone's house with dusty paperbacks and handwritten price tags. I almost walked past it, but a stack of postcards in the window caught my eye. The one on top had a lighthouse on it, the same lighthouse that now stood in silhouette at the far end of the coastline. On impulse, I stepped inside. The woman behind the counter didn't look up. She was old, with wild gray hair and a sweater that had seen too many winters. I browsed aimlessly, not really reading titles, just absorbing the room's stillness. That's when I saw it. Tucked inside a worn copy of The Little Prince was a folded slip of paper. It wasn't a receipt. It was a sketch of me, sitting in the café. My eyes down, my coffee half drunk, my hair falling across my forehead exactly the way it did when I was concentrating. There was no name, no message. But I knew it was her. She'd been here. Recently, I bought the book just to keep the sketch and asked the woman behind the counter if she remembered who sold it. She looked at me for a long moment before shrugging. Quiet girl, always paid in coins, took the same book 3 times and left it every time. Where did she go? I asked. Down by the cliffs, maybe, she said. She liked the sound of the sea. I left with the book clutched to my chest like a compass. The lighthouse was further than it looked. I walked for over an hour, past empty cabins, shuttered cafes, and a beach littered with driftwood and forgotten bottles. The wind picked up as I neared the cliffs, and the air turned colder, sharper, like the town itself didn't want me to reach her. The lighthouse was abandoned, faded white paint peeling from its surface, The door chained shut, but behind it was a path leading to a small cabin nestled between two rocks, almost invisible unless you were looking. The door was slightly ajar. I didn't knock. I just pushed it open and stepped inside. She was there, sitting on the floor, surrounded by canvases and tea mugs, and that same stupid cat, now dry and curled in a ball by the heater. She didn't look surprised. She didn't even look up right away. Just dipped her brush into a jar of water and cleaned it slowly, like she had been expecting this moment and didn't want to rush it. "You found me," she said finally. Her voice was softer than I remembered. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. My throat was dry, my legs trembling. I wanted to scream at her and hold her at the same time. She looked up. Her face was tired. Not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much alone. "I needed to see if you'd come," she said. "Why?" I asked, finally. "Why make me chase you again?" She stood and walked over to the small table by the window. There was another postcard there, blank, addressed to me unsent. "Because I needed to know if I was worth it," she said. "I needed to believe someone would follow me through the silence." "That's not love," I said. "That's a test." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. Maybe, or maybe it's the only way I know how to trust. I didn't answer. Instead, I stepped closer and took her hand. It was cold and paint-stained and trembling. "You could have just stayed," I whispered. I didn't know how. We stayed like that for a long time, standing in the half-light of the cabin, surrounded by the echoes of things we were too afraid to say. When we finally sat, she showed me her sketches, dozens of them, of me, of us, of places I didn't even realize she had been watching. Each one was a memory I thought I'd lost, reborn through her eyes. She'd drawn the way I stirred my coffee, the crease between my brows when I was thinking, the moment I fell asleep on her shoulder during a train ride we took on a whim. "I was always watching," she said, "even when I wasn't brave enough to stay." I wanted to be angry. I wanted to tell her that love shouldn't feel like a maze. But looking at those sketches, I saw her fear for what it really was, a kind of love that had never been given a place to grow safely. And maybe I couldn't fix that. But I could be patient. We stayed in that cabin for 3 days. We didn't talk about the future. We didn't make promises, we just existed, side by side like the tide and the shore. Always meeting, always retreating, always returning. On the morning of the 4th day, she stood at the edge of the cliff and said, "This is the first time I've wanted to go back." "Then let's go," I said. She nodded but didn't move. "What if I run again?" "Then I'll find you again," I said, "but maybe next time, just leave the door open." She smiled, really smiled. And for the first time, I believed it wasn't the wind that brought us together. It was choice. Hard, messy, terrifying choice. We returned to the city slowly, took buses that broke down, trains that stalled, walked miles between towns that barely spoke our language. But with each step, I felt her fear loosen its grip. Not vanish, just soften. She began holding my hand more often. Began whispering things in her sleep that sounded like dreams. We moved into a small apartment with peeling paint and a bathtub that whined like a ghost. But it had windows that caught the sunset and a balcony where we could grow basil and forget to water it. She started painting again. I started writing again. And on quiet nights, we'd sit on the floor and talk about the lives we almost lived. The almost love, the almost loss, the almost leaving. One evening, I found her sitting in the dark, looking out the window with a strange expression. "Do you ever think," she asked, "that maybe love isn't about holding on, but about knowing when to let go?" I didn't know how to answer. She turned to me, eyes glowing with something new. "Because I think I'm ready to stay. But I need to know that if I ever do leave again, it won't break you." I thought about it. About everything we'd been through. About how many times I'd lost her and found her again. And then I said the only thing that felt true. "You can leave 1,000 times. But I'll keep leaving the light on." She kissed me then, and it didn't feel like a climax. It felt like a beginning, like the first real moment in a story we hadn't dared write before. We didn't need vows or rings or guarantees. We just needed each other. Not perfectly, not always easily, but truly. And sometimes that's enough. Until one day, it wasn't. And that's where everything shifted again. But that part of the story, I'll get to that. I should have known that even staying could feel like leaving when you've been shaped by absence your whole life. At first, things felt gentle between us. Familiar, warm, like we'd both exhaled after years of holding our breath. Our small apartment became a kind of sanctuary, mismatched mugs on the shelf, her easel in the corner. My notebooks scattered like breadcrumbs from the couch to the bed. There were mornings I'd wake up and forget what silence used to sound like without her breathing beside me. She smiled more. She laughed at things that weren't even funny, and I convinced myself that this was what healing looked like. A soft return to life. But sometimes healing isn't a straight line. Sometimes it's a spiral. You come back to the same place, the same pain, but just slightly changed. And eventually, we began circling. The first crack came quiet. She started spending more time at the park near the library, sketching strangers again. She said she needed new faces, new colors, that the apartment was starting to feel too known. I said I understood because I thought I did. But understanding someone and keeping them are two different things. Then came the dreams. She started waking up with a tightness in her chest, a look in her eyes like she had just returned from somewhere she didn't want to go. I'd reach for her and she'd flinch. Not away from me, but away from the feeling that clung to her like smoke. "They're just dreams," she would whisper. "But they don't feel like mine." I never pushed. I told myself love was patience. Love was space. Love was silence if that's what she needed. But sometimes silence grows teeth. There was one night. I remember it because it was raining the way it did that first day I followed her trail. When I came home late from work and found her sitting on the floor, surrounded by ripped sketches. Not torn in anger, but in sorrow. Like she was erasing herself page by page. "I don't know who I'm drawing anymore," she said without looking at me. "Every time I finish one, it feels like someone else's hand did it." I knelt beside her, careful, and picked up one of the torn pieces. It was me. Sleeping, my head tilted toward her, peaceful in a way I rarely let myself be. "That's still you?" I said. "That's still your hand." But she shook her head. "It doesn't feel like mine. It feels borrowed. Like I'm trying on someone else's life." That was the first time I felt the shift. Like something unseen had entered the room between us, and we were pretending not to notice. We kept pretending for weeks. We cooked dinner together. We made jokes about the neighbor's dog who barked every time we kissed on the balcony. We watched old movies and argued about endings. But it all felt practiced. Like we were both actors in a play we didn't believe in anymore, but couldn't walk out of. One night, while brushing her hair in the bathroom mirror, she said, "Do you ever wonder if you built a version of me that I'll never be able to live up to?" I stared at her reflection. No. I lied, because the version I built is the one I love. Not some fantasy, just you. But even as I said it, I wondered. Not because she wasn't enough, but because I might have needed her more than she needed herself. And that imbalance, even unspoken, begins to rot the floor beneath you. We stopped touching as often, not out of resentment, but out of hesitation, like we were afraid we might bruise what was left. She started staying up later, alone, drinking tea by the window with a look on her face like she was waiting for something she didn't even believe would arrive. I started waking up earlier, pretending not to notice the cold side of the bed. We didn't fight. That would require friction. We just faded. Then one afternoon, I came home to find a small envelope taped to the door, not sealed, not hidden, just resting there like it had been waiting patiently for my hands. Inside was a single note. "I need to remember who I am when I'm not being loved." No signature, no goodbye, just that sentence. I didn't chase her. Not this time. Maybe because I was tired. Maybe because some part of me finally understood what she'd been trying to say all along, that love, for her, was never a destination. It was a place she visited but never moved into. And I had built a home around someone who still packed bags in her sleep. Days passed. Then weeks. I stopped going to the café. I stopped writing. I even stopped sleeping in our bed, choosing instead to curl up on the couch like an intruder in my own life. Friends asked questions I couldn't answer. "She'll come back," some said. "You're better off," others offered. But I didn't want her back. I wanted us back. The version of us that existed before fear learned how to speak. But I knew that version had died quietly one night while we were both pretending not to hear it scream. Then one evening, long after I'd stopped expecting it, I received a package. No return address, just my name written in black ink. Inside was a stack of sketches, dozens of them. All of me, but not just the me she had loved. There were sketches of me brushing my teeth, of me sitting alone in the cafe, of me sleeping on the couch, curled up like I was protecting something fragile inside. And then at the bottom of the pile was one drawing of her. Just her, looking at me, and written beneath it, in shaky lettering, "Maybe I never left you. Maybe I just didn't know how to stay without losing myself." I stared at that drawing for hours. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat there, feeling the full weight of someone who had been both the safest place and the storm that scattered everything. The next morning, I took the sketch to the window and taped it there, letting the sunlight bleed through it. And for the first time in months, I brewed coffee and didn't stir it. I just let it sit there, bitter and real. I wasn't waiting for her anymore. I wasn't chasing. I wasn't rebuilding what had been. I was just letting it all settle. Like silt in water, like love that had been wrung out until all that remained was memory. A week later, I got another letter. This one was longer, apologetic. Raw. She wrote about the therapist she'd started seeing, the cabin she'd returned to near the cliffs, the things she was starting to unlearn. "I don't know who I'll be when this is over," she wrote, "but I want you to meet her, whoever she becomes." I didn't know if that was a promise or a warning, but I wrote back, not with answers, just with truth. I told her I'd loved her in all her versions, that I had no interest in fixing her, only in knowing her, that if she ever came back, the door would be open, but only if she planned to build something with both hands. Not because I was desperate, but because I had learned something too, that you can't keep bleeding for someone who hasn't learned how to stop cutting. That love needs soil, not just sunlight. That even the strongest roots will rot if the ground is soaked in fear. And yet, part of me still waited. Not in the way I used to. Not like a lighthouse hoping for a ship, but like a seed that understands spring might come again. And one day, when I least expected it, she did return. But not like before. This time, she knocked. This time, she didn't bring silence. She brought questions. This time, she didn't stand at the threshold with one foot out the door. She stepped inside, slowly, with a suitcase and no map. And when I asked her what changed, she said, "I stopped trying to be the person you needed, and I started becoming the person I wanted to be." I nodded. "And who is that?" Her answer came soft but steady, "Someone who stays." Not because she's afraid to be alone, but because she finally believes she's allowed to be loved and still keep herself. We stood there, in the quiet, as two people no longer lost, no longer trying to make sense of the past, just present, breathing. And I knew then whatever came next, it would be different, not easier, not perfect, but honest. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Or maybe not. But this time, we were willing to find out. Together, we didn't rush into anything this time. There were no sweeping reunions, no declarations of forever. Just two people who had once learned the hard way what happens when you skip the foundations and try to live in the attic of a house still under construction. She moved back into the city quietly, into her own apartment just a few streets away from mine. A deliberate choice. "I want to build a bridge," she said, "not a tunnel. I understood. We started with mornings, walks through the neighborhood before the city fully woke, coffee from a new place each week, no expectations except presence. She still carried quiet like a shield, but now she let me step closer. There were no more disappearing acts, no unspoken absences. If she needed space, she said it. If she felt the old urge to run, she told me. And that honesty, raw and unpolished, became the most intimate part of us. One morning, as we sat on a park bench watching a group of kids chase pigeons, she turned to me and said, "I used to think love was about who could hold on the tightest. Now I think it's about who can stand still and trust the other won't drift." I nodded, understanding in a way I hadn't before. I had spent so much time trying to anchor her that I forgot she wasn't the tide. She was the boat learning how to row without capsizing. And now, she rowed beside me, not behind, not ahead. Together, it wasn't perfect. There were days her fear returned with claws. When she'd fall silent mid-conversation, lost in some invisible echo. I didn't fix it, I sat with it, made tea, waited. And sometimes she would cry, not for us, but for the girl she used to be. "I missed so many things," she'd whisper, "so many chances to feel safe, and didn't even know I was allowed to want that." And all I could say was, "You're not too late." Because she wasn't. Not for this. Not for us. Not for herself. Her art began to change too. It grew bolder, less cautious. The lines less delicate, the colors richer. She started painting windows. Dozens of them. Open, closed, cracked. Some with faces peering out, others reflecting skies. "I think I used to be a window that only opened one way," she said once. "But now I think I'm learning how to let things in." I watched her exhibit her work for the first time in years. A small gallery, nothing grand. But it meant the world. She wore a yellow dress and didn't flinch when people stared. And when someone asked who the man was in several of her pieces, she smiled and said, "Someone who taught me that silence doesn't mean absence." That night, she pulled me into her apartment and kissed me like a promise. Not a desperate plea. Not a question. A quiet vow. "I want you to move in," she said breathlessly. I blinked. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more afraid," she said. Which is how I know I'm sure. So I did. We kept my apartment as a studio for me to write in, just in case we needed space. But we filled hers with new habits. Sunday breakfasts on the balcony. Midnight conversations about childhood memories. Shared playlists and overlapping grocery lists. There were moments I'd watch her brush her teeth or tie her hair and think, we made it. But I didn't say it. I didn't want to jinx what felt so impossibly fragile. We started taking short trips. Small towns, unfamiliar cities. She liked the anonymity. I liked the way she held my hand more openly in public. On one trip, in a seaside village, we got caught in a thunderstorm and ducked into an old bookstore. I wandered to the poetry section while she disappeared behind a curtain labeled "Local Art." Minutes later, she returned holding a framed sketch of a lighthouse, eerily similar to the one where I had found her months before. "It's fate," she said with a grin. "Or a reminder," I replied. "Of what?" "That even storms can lead us somewhere we're meant to be." We bought it, hung it above the bed. But even as our lives braided tighter, a part of me remained cautious, not of her, but of the way things had unraveled before. Trauma doesn't vanish with good timing. It waits quiet beneath the surface, testing every new layer of peace. And we were no exception. One night, after an event where I'd introduced her to several of my old friends, she grew distant. Not cold, just withdrawn, as if each smile she had worn had cost her something invisible. "You looked so at ease with them," she said later, curled in bed, staring at the ceiling. "I envied that." "You held your own," I reassured. She nodded, but her lips tightened. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm just your project. Something broken you wanted to fix." I froze. The words weren't new. She had said similar things before. But this time it landed differently. "Is that how you see us?" I asked. She sighed. "No, not most days. But some nights, like this, I wonder if you'd love me if I'd met you when I was more whole." I sat up. But maybe this is what love is. Loving someone as they're becoming, not just when they've already become. She didn't answer. She just turned toward me, eyes soft, vulnerable. Will there come a day when I don't need to ask that question? Maybe, I said. Or maybe the day will come when asking it won't feel like doubt, but like hope. After that night, we talked more about the fears, not less. We didn't tiptoe. We named the shadows. Some days we fought, not with cruelty, but with honesty that cut deeper than either of us expected. But always we came back. We forgave, we grew. And in that rhythm, something changed. She started teaching art classes at a nearby community center. At first, just once a week, then more. The kids adored her. So did the parents. And I think it startled her how much she enjoyed being seen not as broken, but as capable. One afternoon, she came home beaming. A girl asked if she could draw like me someday, she said. And I told her yes. I didn't even hesitate. I kissed her then, overwhelmed with pride. Not just for her, but for the journey we had walked, from disappearing acts to declarations, from fear to firelight. And then, just as everything seemed to settle into something lasting, life offered us one more twist. I found an envelope in our mailbox. No return address. Inside was a letter. From her mother, the one who had left when she was 10. It was dated weeks ago. No apology, just updates. A town she had moved to. A new family. A curious inquiry. Does your heart still draw windows? I handed it to her in silence. She read it in one long breath, then folded it and placed it back into the envelope without a word. Do you want to go? I asked. To see her? I don't know, she admitted. Maybe. I took her hand. Then I'll go with you, if you want. What if I don't? Then we'll stay, I said. And we'll make tea. And we'll sit on the balcony and talk about what it means to be a daughter, even when no one teaches you how. She looked at me then, tears in her eyes but not falling. You always say the right thing. No, I replied. I just finally understand when not to say the wrong thing. We didn't decide that day, or the next. The letter stayed on the kitchen table like a guest we weren't ready to greet. But something in her posture shifted. Not lighter, not resolved, just taller, like she had grown into a version of herself that could face the past, not to relive it, but to lay it to rest. That night, as we lay in bed, she turned to me and whispered, I'm not running. I know, I said. But if you do, just remember, I'm not chasing, I'm walking beside you. Always. And in the quiet that followed, I knew we weren't the same people who met in a silent café or chased each other across cities and cliffsides. We were something new, something earned. And though the story wasn't over, far from it, we had finally reached a place where neither of us needed to vanish to feel safe. We had become each other's lighthouse. And even when the wind changed again, I knew this time we'd face the storm side by side. It didn't happen all at once, the moment we knew we had made it. There was no ribbon cutting, no final scene with music swelling behind us. It unfolded slowly in the small acts of staying, in her placing her shoes beside mine by the door each night instead of in the hallway, in me learning how to give her silence that wasn't absence but presence. The letter from her mother stayed untouched for a while. She didn't bring it up, and I didn't ask. It became part of the furniture, always there, always waiting. And then one Saturday morning, over coffee, she slid it across the table toward me and said, I think I'm ready. I knew what she meant. I didn't try to prepare a speech or suggest how to feel. I simply nodded and said, then we'll go together. The town was 2 hours away, a cluster of quiet streets with tired buildings and tidy gardens, the kind of place people move to when they want to forget the noise of the world. She gripped my hand tight the whole ride, not out of fear, but as if anchoring herself to the version of her that had chosen to face this. Her mother's house was smaller than we imagined. Blue shutters, a rocking chair out front, and a wind chime that sounded like it hadn't been touched by wind in years. I waited on the sidewalk as she approached the door alone. From that distance, I watched her take a breath so deep it seemed to draw in years. When the door opened, I expected a reaction. Shock, tears, something cinematic. But her mother just stood there, mouth parted slightly, hands at her sides. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw the moment her mother reached out, unsure, and my girl leaned forward and hugged her. Not tightly. Not as a daughter desperate for a return, but as a woman finally unburdening the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. They spoke for an hour. I stayed outside, walking the street, watching clouds drift in a sky that looked like it could rain but wouldn't. When she returned, her eyes were red but not shattered. She didn't apologize, she said, but I think she wanted to. Do you feel better? I asked. She shook her head. No, but I feel done. And I understood. Closure isn't always about peace. It's about putting down what you've carried for too long. We drove home in silence. Not the kind that divided us, but the kind that let the air breathe. She rested her head on my shoulder at a red light, and in that stillness I felt the shift again. Not back to how things were, but into something sturdier. We kept living. That was the magic. Not grand gestures, but daily choosing. She started working on a book, her art and fragments of her journal entries, sketches of windows and waves, of a girl staring out and learning to stare in. I finished my first collection of poems in years. Many of them about her, but not the her I had met, the her she had become. We hosted dinners in our apartment. We adopted a dog with uneven ears. We argued about where to put the bookshelf and how many plants were too many. And slowly, life became less about recovering and more about arriving. There was a moment, months after the visit to her mother, when we were walking home from the market, bags swinging at our sides, the late sun cutting gold lines through the buildings. She stopped suddenly and turned to me. Do you think we've changed too much to still be who we were? I smiled. I think we had to change to become who we were supposed to be. She nodded. I'm not afraid anymore. Of leaving, I asked. She shook her head. Of staying. And that, for her, was everything. Still, time moved, as it does. And then came the autumn when I got the call about the job offer overseas. A writing fellowship in Lisbon. Something I had dreamed of, joked about, never thought real. I told her over dinner. She paused mid-bite, looked up, and said, When do we leave? I blinked. Wubbly? You didn't think I'd let you go alone, did you? It's a year, I reminded. A whole year? Exactly, she said. A whole year of different sunlight and new coffee shops and balconies with views we don't yet understand. I laughed, half in relief, half in awe. You really want to go? I want us to go, she said. Together. We sold most of what we owned, kept a few boxes in storage, kissed friends goodbye, and stepped into a new chapter. Lisbon was kind to us. She learned Portuguese faster than I did. She painted with different light, different shadows. I wrote every morning on a balcony that faced the sea, and every evening. We'd walk cobbled streets hand in hand, no map, no plan. But it wasn't the city that made it magical. It was that we had built something strong enough to carry across oceans. One night, on a rooftop overlooking the city's blinking lights, she handed me a new postcard, blank on the back. On the front was a sketch of two boats floating beside each other in an endless sea. This is us, she said, still rowing, still side by side. And I knew what she meant. We had come a long way from that first silent coffee shop, from the vanishing acts and folded notes and runaway mornings. We had come through the forgetting and the remembering, through the storms and the cliffside cabins. We had come home, not to a place, but to each other. On the day our year ended, we returned to the city not with dread, but with a kind of reverence. We found a new apartment, not far from the first, with a rooftop garden and a bathtub that didn't scream. We kept living. We didn't make it a fairy tale. We kept our wounds, but let them heal. We still fought sometimes, still needed space, still had quiet days. But we never stopped showing up. One morning, while she was sketching on the windowsill and I was editing a line I couldn't quite get right, she said, without looking up, I think we made it. I set down my pen and walked to her, kissed the top of her head. "We're still making it." She smiled. "Good." And then, with the same calm certainty she'd once used to vanish, she looked up at me and said, "I want to marry you." My breath caught. "Here? Not in this room?" she said with a smirk. "In this life." I said yes, not like a proposal answered, but like an echo finally returned to its origin. We married the next spring. Not in a church, not in a hall. Just us, a few friends, her sister, my brother, a garden full of lilacs, and the wind soft as breath. She wore a dress with pockets. I carried a poem in mine. And when we read our vows, they didn't sound like promises. They sounded like things we had already done, things we would keep doing, staying, listening, believing. Afterward, we stood alone beneath the trees. The world hushed around us, and she whispered, "I still carry the first note you ever wrote me." I laughed. "I didn't write you a note." She reached into her booklet and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was the one I had written that night she vanished the second time. The one I had never sent. "I'll keep the light on." "How did you get this?" I asked, stunned. She smiled. "You left it on your desk." I took it when I left. I wasn't ready then, but I needed a part of you to remind me what I was walking toward. I didn't cry. I held her, and we stayed like that until the sun dipped low, our shadows long and braided. Now, years later, I still find her notes in the pockets of jackets. Sketches of me brushing my teeth, sleeping on the couch, laughing at nothing. She still draws windows. I still write poems. And sometimes when the wind shifts suddenly and I think of who we were, how we almost missed this, how we almost let fear write the ending, I look at her and whisper the thing I've learned to be truest of all. You were never hard to love, just hard to convince. And she always replies the same way. But you waited, and that changed everything. The story could end here, but really it doesn't, because staying, loving, choosing it doesn't end. It keeps happening, with every morning coffee, with every word left unsaid, then finally spoken. With every return, we are still writing it. Every day. And somehow, that's the most unexpected ending of all. That after all the silence, all the storms, all the chances to walk away, we stayed. Enjoyed the video? Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you never miss an update.